Welcome to our July garden. At this time of year, plants are large and growth is fast. For that reason, we need to be on the ball with regular harvesting and pruning. But it also might surprise you that we're still planting quite a bit. In this video, I'll share some of the lessons from our activities in this past month. I'll show you how we trellis and prune our cucumbers and melons, and how we determine the perfect time to harvest our hardneck garlic. We'll also look at a few specific examples of relay planting, that is the practice of growing multiple crops in the same bed in the same season. Yes, this is even possible in a cold climate with a short growing season like ours. But before we get into those lessons, I couldn't resist kicking things off with a quick update on our wheat trial. Let's get started. This month we're going to start things off in our wheat section. Here we've got 9 standard beds planted to red Fife heritage wheat. I took a risk based on research when we started off this spring and used a really wide spacing because I found some research that showed the older varieties of wheat actually perform better when they're used with wider spacing. So we went with about an average of 6 inches between all of our plants here, which would be outrageously large spacing compared to a standard wheat field throughout the Canadian prairies here. Those growers would use something more around the range of 25 plants per square foot. This is more like 4 plants per square foot. And the reason heritage wheat performs better with larger spacing is that they have an ability to produce more heads per plant. So after finding that research in spring, I trusted it, went with the wider spacing in good faith that each of our plants would end up producing a lot more heads than the typical modern wheat variety. So those wheat varieties out covering thousands of acres across Canada right now are producing around 3 heads per plant. But these heritage wheat plants right here, we've just been counting them, are now up to around 20 heads per plant with their additional space. So you can see just one plant here has an outstanding number of heads. We could count this one quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So we've got 18 heads on this single plant. So I did a little math before coming out here today to answer the question of how many heads would we need on every one of our plants to match the head density that a huge grower would want. They're aiming for something in the order of 500 heads per square yard. And in order for us to achieve that same density, we would need 14 heads per plant. And here we've got more than that. And if we're averaging now more around 20 heads per plant, then we're going to be well able to match that head density that a larger grower would have with more wheat seeds producing fewer heads per plant. So I'm excited about that. One thing that's interesting to note about these heads is that they're not all maturing at the same time though. We've got some that are just starting down below and others that are much further along up above. And this is an undesirable thing to have happen when you're growing thousands of acres of wheat because you can't spray fungicide on them. Those farmers would want to spray their fungicide when their heads are all at the same stage, and that's not possible when you're growing like this because the heads are all at different stages. So I'm continuing to enjoy learning more about the wheat throughout the process here, and I'll keep you posted as things develop in the next month. Let's move on to some of the vegetable crops inside here. In these 2 beds here, we started the season with beets transplanted here in early May, and lettuce transplanted here also in early May. The beets were harvested last week. Here's a look at that process. They were grown entirely under insect netting to prevent damage from leaf miner flies. Now their leaves are nice and clean, and that's great because we eat the leaves sometimes, and that's also the reason why I'm storing, when harvesting, all of the crop. I'm not just chopping the leaves. If this was a fall harvest, I would probably just chop the leaves and only worry about washing and storing the roots. But here I'm harvesting the whole plant. Lettuce came out early July and we transplanted that with more lettuce and turnips in the middle. I'll just zip this off quickly. I don't want to leave this one uncovered for long because turnips are so desirable to a lot of pests around here. So transplanted turnips in groups of 3, so those were started in multi-plant blocks, so 3 plants per soil block, and that allowed me to transplant them together, and they'll also continue to grow together at that high density. These aren't those huge turnips that you might see in the grocery store, or maybe you've grown them before too. These are salad turnips that we only want to grow to about a size of 2 inches in diameter at the most, a little bigger than a golf ball. So these transitions were a lot easier. In both cases, we took all of the other crop out, put the new crop in, loosen the soil a little bit in between with a garden fork, didn't even remove the drip irrigation. It's just a really small space to work with here, so we could just do that carefully. And since all of these crops require some insect protection as well, got the hoops here and the netting to prevent moths or flies from laying eggs on our leaves and introducing more insect problems to our garden. Now let's look at some trellising action back here. There's a neat comparison we can do right now between our melons and cucumbers. So that's what I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes on here. Melons and cucumbers are closely related, but we need to handle them differently to produce a crop. First of all, let's just focus our energy on cucumbers. I've postponed a little bit of pruning and lower and leaning here so we can talk you through that process. We've got the tomato hooks here that unwind freely, so I can increase the height of my trellis effectively by allowing some of that twine to unravel. And so while the vine just moments ago was far surpassing the length of, or the height of the trellis, I can drop it down, slide it around this side, hang it here, and now it's got space to grow again. But I don't want to have a bunch of these leaves laying on the soil, inviting problems with disease and breakage and stuff. So I'm going to prune those lower leaves that are touching the soil. So I've just got a vine down there that's pretty clean. Now we're going to repeat the same thing with the next one. And every time I'm winding a vine around a piece of twine, or winding a piece of twine around a vine, I'm doing the action in a clockwise manner so that I'm never unraveling some winding that I've previously done. So establish a pattern like that for yourself as well, so you can always do it the same direction. So we slide that one over, we've lowered it. I'm going to prune some of these lower leaves off so they're not bunching up along the ground here. And I'm also looking for side shoots that are forming. So there's an example of a side shoot. It's different than just a leaf because it's got these little buds forming in the middle there. See? So that's not just a leaf. If it was just a leaf, it would look like that, just a leaf by itself, but it had these other buds as well. So that's a good indication. It's a side shoot. And it's also not the first thing to form. There's already an existing leaf there, and there's also a fruit forming there as well at that same node. So ideally you want to get them when they're young like that, so the plant hasn't invested a bunch of energy in developing that side shoot already. But if they got a little bigger, you may need to snip them as well. So let's do the next one here as well. Give it a couple of wraps in the clockwise direction and let it sit there. And I'll prune off the bottom leaves. I want to do this pruning regularly, like once a week should be enough to help you keep up with your plants. The problem with letting it get beyond that is I end up having to do like what I just did there, is like cut off a substantial amount of leaves at one instance, and I'd rather not inflict that amount of shock on my plants if it's not necessary. So there's our new cucumber from the other side coming around the corner, and our last couple of shifts over here from this side. There, so now we've gone from a position of having all of our cucumbers surpassing the height of our trellis to having the tips all below the height of our trellis. And we can continue this spiraling through the whole season, keep everything neat and tidy here. It's not the only way to grow cucumbers, but I really like keeping their tips growing vertically. If they come up to the top and then start wandering back down, their tips continue to want to try to go up, and it gets messy and you start having a lot of vines snap on you. And this also keeps all of our fruit at the same height. Our fruit will kind of always be in this level throughout the season, so we know where to look. We're missing fewer fruit throughout the harvesting period. That's always a good thing. A couple more to snip off here. Before we move on to the melons, I just want to point out a significant difference between these two crops. The cucumbers here are forming right along the main stem. So we've got cucumber at that node, cucumber, cucumber, right along the main stem. So we're free to prune all of these little shoots off of that main stem without affecting fruit production. But that is not okay if we're talking about melons. So let's look at the difference with our melon crop. Where's a good example here? Right off in our first plant. So if we were just to follow up the main stem here, starting from the bottom of this plant, at every node we have flowers, but those flowers are male flowers, they're not female flowers. So if we were just to prune our melon plants the same way as our cucumber plants, they would grow vertically just wonderfully, but they would produce no fruit because the female flowers on our melon plants, excuse me, get out of there, Vine. The female flowers on our melon plants only come out at the first node on the lateral branches. So the lateral branch is something that comes out of the main stem to the side. So this one has already emerged. It formed a female flower there. It got pollinated successfully, and now we've got a melon forming. That wouldn't have happened if we pruned off this lateral branch from the main stem. So that's a good thing, to keep this lateral branch up to that female flower, but beyond that we want to prune it off because we're growing in a really high density scenario here where we've got each of our plants trained vertically. There's no room for sprawling. If we were out on an acreage or something, if we were growing on an acreage with an abundance of space, I would plant my melons with wider spacing, let them sprawl, operate a pretty low maintenance plot, much like we do for our winter squash here, and just come back and see what we get at the end of the season. But in this case, when we're trying to optimize yield in a very confined area, we need to plant at a higher density and then make an effort to control that density so we don't have too much competition here. We only let our melons set 1 or 2 fruit per plant, and then we control the stem density by pruning these laterals so that we get a balance between the leaf production and the fruit production. And with that extra bit of management, we can achieve a higher yield per square foot here than we could in a scenario where we were letting them sprawl out in an open field. So we'll continue here with this pruning regimen. Once they get to the top, we'll let them sprawl around there because all of our melons will be forming kind of around waist height here. We'll support them with plastic mesh sacks fastened to the twine as we've done in previous years, and just look forward to enjoying some juicy melons come August. We'll start things off here with our hardneck garlic, which you also can notice is starting to dry off on the leaf tips here. As soon as you notice those leaf tips of your garlic drying, you need to start really paying attention. And that's because it's an indication that the optimal harvest window is approaching, and it's a narrow one for garlic. So you really want to get this right. The trick with garlic is to harvest when the bulb has got as large as possible. So we want to give the plant time to grow that bulb as much as it can, but we don't want to wait to the point that all of these outer protective layers have disintegrated, exposing the inner cloves and allowing those to get dirty, making them more vulnerable to rot and infection, and allowing them to lose their moisture faster than they would have otherwise. So we want to allow our bulbs to get as big as possible while still maintaining a significant number of layers intact to protect our bulb in storage. And if we do that right, we can have excellent storage qualities with our garlic. This is garlic that's in great shape still from last season. So let's look at what it takes to determine the perfect time to harvest. Let's have a close look at a couple of these plants. I brought a board out here to put behind a plant so that we can easily count the leaves. And that's what's important here. So every one of those outer layers that I just rubbed off of this garlic head is directly tied to one of these leaves on the main stem. And as these leaves on the main stem start to dry up, it's an indication that the associated layer around the bulb has disintegrated. So we need to watch these leaves very carefully. If they're still green, it means the layer is intact down below. If they're brown and totally shriveled up, that means the layer is gone. So how do we know how many layers are left? Well, we start from the top of the plant and we count downward, counting every single green leaf along the way. So this plant will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 layers fully intact right now. This leaf it's got a brown streak in it. We could say that we've got 8.5 layers down below intact on our bulb. We've learned just from trial and error about getting this timing right that if we harvest our bulbs when they have at least 6 layers still remaining, that we get great storage quality. So we never want to let our garlic plants dry out beyond that. We always want to make sure we're harvesting when we still have at least 6 green leaves here. Could we harvest this plant when it has 8.5 green leaves here? Yes, it would come out fine. It would store pretty well. The cloves would already be separated, but we would just miss out on a little bit more yield that we could obtain by letting the garlic plants sit here and mature for an extra week or two at this point in the season. Now these plants won't mature with perfect uniformity. So when you are assessing your garlic patch, do count more than one plant and make that decision to harvest when you start to notice that about 50% of them are getting to the stage of having 6 green leaves. Then you're good to go. Just pull the whole patch and start the curing process. There you go. Never have to dig up your garlic plants. Just use that trick and you'll be good to go. In this bed, we used to have a full crop of carrots. They've been harvested back in early July. And I've just transplanted beets here, much like I've done in the brassica tunnel. Only these beets didn't have the shade of cauliflower to contend with. But I did still make use of some shade cloth here to help them, because we did have an incredibly hot stretch a couple of weeks ago. And I needed to get my beets into the ground at that time in order for them to mature. I also couldn't afford to leave them in their soil blocks for much longer. So it was a case of needing to plant no matter what. I couldn't wait any longer. So in order to transplant beets and have them be happy with me, despite it being plus 35, I took advantage of my shade cloth to help manage that stress for these plants, and they're looking really great now. I don't see any sign of stress with my leaves. Normally if I transplant them in really hot weather and I'm not as cautious there, we'll have some yellowing of the leaves, indicating that they were under too much heat stress, but these look great. So this will be our fall crop of storage beets. This is Forma Nova, a cylindrical beet that's long and skinny and nice for slicing and stores great as well. Yeah, and I waited to take off the shade cloth to show you it, but now they'll just grow to maturity under this insect netting to keep off the leaf miners. As July wraps up, our attention can start to shift toward bringing in the first of our larger harvests like onions, garlic, and even oats. This is when we really start to recuperate the upfront investments we've made in our garden plots. I hope that the lessons shared today have given you some ideas and methods you can start to implement in your home garden. These are just a few clips from the full garden tours that I offer to course members every month of the growing season. If you're serious about growing your own food, leave a comment below and let me know what subjects you'd like to see included in future garden tour selections like this. See you in the next one.